here we go. Calling it the 7 pillars of women's empowerment and the divine feminine and rising. The point being, these need to merge. So the left and the right need to merge. And that's what I'm hoping to present for you here. So right now, women are half the world's population. And yet, in 2020, they are not considered equals in most parts of the world. And despite our attempts in the social impact space to direct funding to organizations that serve women and girls, support is surprisingly deficient when compared with philanthropic giving overall. In 2019, the Women's Philanthropy Institute, which is out of Indiana University in the US, published the first Women and Girls Index. And it measured giving to more than 45,000 organizations in the US dedicated to women and girls. The findings show that only 1.6% of all philanthropic support in the US goes to women and girls, right? We additionally found that through studies of foundation giving in both the US and Europe, researchers estimate that only about 7% of all foundation grants specifically benefit women and girls. So if that doesn't blow you away, I don't know what will. It blew me away. So with the growing acceptance that making investments in women and girls promotes a ripple effect of change throughout families, their communities, and even entire countries, why isn't more funding going to the empowerment of girls and women? And what can we do about that? Perhaps the answer lies in the confusion over how to support women and girls around the globe. Of the philanthropic giving that's directed toward women, 90 cents of each dollar are focused on reproductive health, leaving inadequate funding for the range of other issues that affect women and girls. The factors that will lead to women rising into co-equal partnership with men are varied, and they go beyond reproductive health, as important as that is. Intersectionality is a term that we use in women's empowerment, and it came about in the late 80s as a way to understand the complexities around women's lives and to develop solutions that would take these complexities into account. It was coined by a woman by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, and the essence of intersectionality is that gender alone does not determine women's lived experiences. According to Crenshaw, intersectionality is a way to see multiple forms of exclusion, as well as to advocate for women of all backgrounds and identities. So what does that mean for those of us who desire to lift women up and out of oppression? It means that we need to focus on multiple issues at the same time. We can't just devote resources in one area and expect that that will be enough. But it can be a daunting task to try to sift through all of the data and information to identify those efforts that have the greatest potential for impact. There are so many existing frameworks that are used by different organizations, but not one single framework that is commonly used across the fields. I'll give you an example of that. We know we're all very familiar with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But here's the thing. They're not specific to women. They do not organize the topics that improve women's lives holistically in one place. And they can be overwhelming because there are 19 of them. So what can feel overwhelming, I propose, does not have to be. And in an effort to simplify the approach that we better focus our efforts in the places where we're likely to have the greatest impacts, I have created what I'm calling the 7 pillars of empowerment and the divine feminine rising. So what I've done is I'm using research from the Center for High Impact Philanthropy, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. They have found the 5 areas where the most promising solutions exist to have the greatest impact on the lives of women and girls globally. And what they say is that these 5 areas are inextricably linked and provide a holistic view on how to create the greatest impact. So I'm going to start with those as kind of the center of our 7 pillars. So you'll see me jump to pillar number 2, and we'll circle back to pillar number 1. So the first area that we need to be focused on is health and well-being, so that women are free from disease and pain and able to live full and flourishing lives. Now, they've determined under each pillar the areas of focus that are most critical. And so they start with nutrition. WASH is a term that we use for water, sanitation, and hygiene. Addressing any issues of mental illness, addiction, and using trauma-informed care. Of course, reproductive health. And interestingly, the presence of a skilled attendant at birth, because death in childbirth is still, sadly, happens far too often around the globe. Other issues that would come under this pillar would include menstrual hygiene, because that oftentimes keeps girls from going to school, any form of disease. And then in the more developed countries, healthcare reform, and looking at the options for alternative and holistic healthcare. So that's pillar number 2, health and well-being. Pillar number 3, education, so that women have access to knowledge and educational opportunities in order to cultivate learning and expand their possibilities in life. The key factors under education include compulsory and tuition-free education, school environment, what's the infrastructure and resources available, what's the geographic distance from a child's home, is water and sanitation available. Any issues of health that would keep children from attending school, infectious diseases, rates of teen pregnancy. Cultural norms, what is the attitude toward child marriage? Are little girls married off early? And overall gender roles, are they allowed to go to school? And then safety, what's the safety issues in the country, in their home, and in the school? Other issues that would come under the education pillar, school uniforms, education reform overall, particularly in looking at that in the United States, online education options, arts and the humanities in the school, and even access to sports for girls in the school. Pillar number 4, economic empowerment, so that women are enabled to achieve economic success and have agency over financial decision making. In other words, do they have a say in the finances of their home? Things that we see that impact this: female labor force participation in skills training. They have the option to get a job. They have access to capital, particularly if they're interested in being in entrepreneurship. Internet and mobile phones are very critical. Mobile phones are typically a way of providing banking in, believe it or not, in less developed countries. Whether or not they were able to go to school, whether or not they were have any decision over marriage, when and whom to marry, when and how many children to have, whether or not to leave a marriage. Property rights, such as the ability to own land, to own livestock, or to own small farm equipment. And then equitable work-related policies and practices, so equal pay for equal work, paid time off, paid maternity leave, freedom from discriminatory labor policies. And other things that would come under this economic empowerment pillar, particularly in developed countries, would be conscious business. So, changing capitalism to conscious business. Profit plus purpose, as I call it. Okay, and then finally, pillar 5, freedom, not finally, but pillar 5, freedom from violence, a critical piece. So that women are free from violence and other harmful practices that undermine bodily autonomy and well-being. This is such a critical pillar. Things that impact the likelihood of a woman or a girl being a victim of violence, whether or not she goes to school, whether or not she is married off as a child, whether or not she lives in poverty. The attitudes toward women in society, particularly violence against women. What economic opportunities for women exist. Other things, I clicked too quickly, but other things that would come under that critical pillar of freedom from violence would include all of the areas where violence occurs: domestic violence, human trafficking, prostitution, pornography, female genital mutilation, acid attacks, honor killings, mass rape, if that doesn't make you sad. right there. And then, of course, the bigger issues of war and terrorism, gun control, and again, in the United States, prison reform, and even Veterans Affairs would all come under the pillar of freedom from violence. And then the last pillar that the Center for High Impact Philanthropy focuses on is equality overall. And under that pillar, they focus particularly on, once again, education and economic opportunities for women, but also on the presence of a female political quota. So are women involved in politics? And I would add to that, are women involved in senior leadership in corporations or on boards at corporations? Other areas here would include anything like legal, human, and property rights. Diversity and inclusion issues would come under this pillar, immigration reform. So what you'll see is of the 5 pillars that are in between my anchor pillars, there's a lot of overlap. As you can see, you cannot focus on education unless you're also focused on the health of a child. You cannot focus on economic empowerment unless you're focused on education and health. You cannot focus on economic empowerment if someone is a victim of violence. So all of these are interconnected. And so we really need to be looking holistically at how we lift women up and out of oppression. So what we do know is there is great work being done on the ground to address these issues that keep women and children disempowered. The question that I ask is it enough? Are we moving women on from a life of suppression and oppression quickly enough and at scale? And what might we be missing? So my question is, can we really make an impact on the empowerment of women and children if we're living under the old constructs and beliefs of a patriarchal, hierarchical society? Constructs and beliefs around culture, religion, politics, business, education, healthcare, that we have in many ways accepted for ourselves as truth until now. The rise of the divine feminine on the planet is shifting the way we look at women and men, the roles we play, the privileges we have, where the power is held, and ultimately the imbalance that is prevalent in all sectors. And it's time to incorporate 2 long forgotten pillars into the women's empowerment movement and all sectors of society. These are anchor pillars that we've spent a lot of time talking about this past week in this sacred room we've been in. It is time to remember the feminism of the past, the patriarchy of the past, and how they now lead us to the rise of the divine feminine. So the way we do that is with the 2 anchor pillars. Pillar number 1 is reconnecting to Mother Earth. Women and children are significantly impacted by the desecration of our planet. So healing the planet is a critical step in lifting them out of oppression. And the key factors that would come under this pillar are things that you've seen before: wash, water, sanitation, and hygiene, our food supply. Animal welfare, a critical piece that we haven't talked about, but where most of the harm is done to our animal population is in the manufacturing of our food. And that needs to be addressed, at least here in the United States. Of course, environmental sustainability, climate change, and natural disasters. And then affordable and clean energy would also come under this pillar. And finally, pillar number 7, what I call restoring the sacred feminine. Remembering, as we've talked about this week, all life is sacred. We need to remember this for ourselves. We need to remember that we are sacred, and then we need to share this with all humanity. This is where we know that everything is sacred. There's a deep sense of inherent worth and dignity in each of us. This is where rising consciousness and a new spirituality emerges. We remember our authentic self, where we find self-empowerment and self-responsibility. And we have the ability to attain the freedom that our soul remembers, all of which leads to unity, light, love, and compassion. It is my belief that if the sacred is restored, all of the other pillars will take care of themselves. Here's how I see it. Those are our anchor pillars, restoring the sacred feminine at the top, reconnecting to Mother Earth at the bottom, and the 5 other pillars within. We return to the sacred. It leads to empowerment, which ultimately leads to peace on earth. We learned this week that there won't be peace until the voices of the grandmothers are heard. And we desperately need the voice of women to lead us out of the darkness and into the light. To remember our truth, to remember we are all connected, and to remember that we are divine. And this beautiful quote from Megan Watterson. She realized that all along within her she contained the power to save herself, and so she did. And that is where I will leave you.